Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ich habe selbstverständlich eine Ansprache im Polnischen vorbereitet für unseren Gast heute und da wird gelacht und das muss ich sofort zurückweisen und habe mir nur gedacht, dass es für diesen Kreis vielleicht doch sinnvoller ist, wenn wir uns in der Sprache verständigen, die in Europa einfach üblich war, das heißt im Lateinischen, und ich hoffe, Sie sind damit einverstanden. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and supporters of the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture, I would hereby like to welcome you to a special lecture as part of the forum Law as Culture, as you know. Karol Berger, here present, will give a lecture at the Käte Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities on the topic, as you know. And it had been on display, but we moved it away. Das weiß ich jetzt nicht, wie man das richtig korrekt im Amerikanischen ausspricht. Ich versuche es mal. Richard Wagner and the Law. The lecture touches an issue of our center we are primarily going to deal with from October 2014 onwards. It is about the interaction between law and the arts in a broader sense. Where does the underlying relationship of law and literature come from? What are the commonalities between Kanun, in Arabic for law, and canon as a musical term? Why is there such a wealth of paintings of law from Daumier to Klimt and Marcel Odenbach, as we could experience in a conversation with the artist at an event at the Kunstmuseum Bonn? But such a dearth, so to say, of legal music, Rechtsmusik, ein merkwürdiger Begriff. These are but some of the research questions that we will cover in this research year that comes from October on, so we are a little bit in advance. These are some of them. Therefore, we are fortunate to welcome the renowned musicologist and art theorist Karol Berger, and especially I'm thinking at his wonderful book, A Theory of Art, who comes from Stanford to the prelude to this research focus. So how did a poor sociologist and jurist come across somebody so much sophisticated in the fine arts? A common experience as evaluators of the French Centers for Advanced Study was able to create a kind of common feeling about what counts for this type of the growth of knowledge so difficult to reach in the field of cultural studies and the humanities. And this seems especially true for the realm of musicology, I would say. Sociologists had access to the world of sounds mainly by way of two major studies. The one dealing with an explanation why even in that a seemingly irrational sphere like music, the power of Occidental rationalization is so strong that only the septimer chord reminds us of something underlying irrationalities. That is why Weber's study about the sociology, there is a mistake in my sentence. So I simply wanted to say there is this wonderful study made by Weber, and this is the link to his understanding of the law is a complicated one, where he speaks about the Occidental rationalization of the law. But the first study was not about the law, it was about music. What is the way from music to law in Weber's theorizing? So the other theorist, sociologist we are interested in, it is Norbert Elias, and who tried to explain the singularity of an individual, a genius, namely Mozart, by way of sociological tools. An incredible book, the best one, to my understanding, that Elias ever had written, among a lot of wonderful essays and huge books he had written. But what about Wagner and his relation to the law? Karol Berger is the person to tell us the story. He's the Osgood Hooker Professor in Fine Arts at the Department of Music, as well as an affiliated faculty, the Department of German Studies, and an affiliated researcher at the Europe Center at Stanford University. You are a native of Poland, living in the US since, I don't know if this is completely correct, but since '68. I found it in the biography. You received your PhD from Yale in 1975, and you taught at Stanford since '82. You received an impressive number and quality of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. I'm glad that Dr. Melich could come over to attend the lecture. Thank you very much for being with us. The American Council of Learned Societies, the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Study and Conference Center and Stanford Humanities Center. Furthermore, in 2011 and 12, you have been the Euria Senior Fellow at the Institute für die Wissenschaften for Menschen in Vienna, by the way, the same place where Martha Buchholz had been, a former fellow at our center. In 2005 and 2006, you were the Robert Lehman Visiting Professor, not for the Lehman Brothers, if I see it's another family, at Villa Itati, the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies. You are a foreign member of the Polish Academy of Sciences and an honorary member of the American Musicological Society. And from today on, you will be an honorary member of our center, by the way. His Musica Ficta received the 8080 Otto Kinkel Award on the American Musicological Society. His Bach's Cycle, Mozart's Arrow, the 2008 Marjorie Weston Emerson Award of the Mozart Society of America. You may say, why it is so long? There is much more to say, but any prize is so hard to win. And if the list is long, and if it is so many prizes, I insist to name everything. In 2011, you received the Gullerian Prize from the Swiss Musicology Society, but there is another news, a very recent news, and you might be surprised, some of you at least, because most recently you received the Humboldt Forschungspreis für Geisteswissenschaften in March. And this is the highest prize the national German intellectual academic community has to deliver. Congratulations for that. I beg your pardon for all the omissions I must have made, but the range of awards and recognitions gives a clear image of the range of interests and competence you brought with you. Wagner remains a delicate topic for a lot of reasons. Charisma and charismatic structures of Gemeinschaftsbildung remain suspicious for the sociologist and some others also. The lending of a German myth transmitted by the unknown inventor, the medieval story of the Nibelungen Lied, and then transformed and transposed in a tension between modernity and pre-modernity, between Gesellschaft und Gemeinschaft, raises the question of the place of law in a rather unlawful climate of robbery, broken contracts, incestuous desires, and megalomania. That's a little bit the topics of The Ring, if I understand right. So we look forward to learn more about this guy and what he thought about the law and how he was representing it, or even not able to represent the law, because this is the problem. How law can be displayed or made accessible through music. The most irrational, some of us at least have experienced in their life. And Weber said perhaps not for bad reasons that a similar experience he did only find in the erotic sphere. So it's your turn now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gebhardt, for this exceedingly generous introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation. I have to tell you immediately that I know absolutely nothing about the law. I am not a legal scholar. I am simply a music historian, and I am working on late music dramas of Richard Wagner in last few years, and I'm trying to place them in intellectual map of the mid-19th century, among other things. And I want just to share with you some thoughts about one of these dramas here. I will be very curious to know what your reaction will be. I am reading this excerpt from the book for the first time, so it's a premiere for me. Richard Wagner was often on the wrong side of the law. Driven by an appetite for luxury, he felt his creativity required, unable or unwilling to live within his means, unreasonably optimistic about his future sources of income. He repeatedly found himself in situations in which he had to cross borders in order to escape his creditors. In addition, driven by revolutionary enthusiasm, he took active part in the Dresden Uprising of May 1849 at the side of the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, and when the uprising failed, only a lucky last-moment escape abroad saved him from a possible death sentence and, in any case, certainly long-term imprisonment. For more than a decade, he had to live in exile in Switzerland, unable to re-enter other German-speaking lands. He was, in short, a serial outlaw, repeatedly breaking the laws that govern both the economic and the political functioning of his society. But it is not Wagner's biography that will be my concern here. Rather, I would like to consider the prominent role played by law in one of the composer's central works, the four-evening music dramatic cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, for which Wagner wrote the text between 1848 and 1852. And the music between 1853 and 1874. Many details of the allegory that is the ring are unclear and are likely to remain subject of diverse interpretations for a long time to come, none so more than the ending. But the most general outline of the allegory is neither opaque nor particularly controversial. This is a story of the twilight of the gods, the end of the old regime that has ruled the world until now, so that it might be replaced by something better. That's essentially what the story is. The old regime has locked in a life and death struggle two competing powers. The traditional political power of the aristocratic, pleasure-loving elite and beauty-loving elite of mountain-height gods, led by Wotan, power resting on legal and constitutional arrangements that had been accumulating since the beginning of history, and that limit this elite's freedom of action. For instance, the freedom of action in dealing with the giants, who are the gods' providers of paid labor. And on the other hand, the more recent, modern economic power of the capital, accumulated by the new financial elite of plutocrats, like the subterranean dwarf Alberich, who forswears the sensuous beauty and pleasure of love for the sake of single-minded acquisition of wealth, power resting on nothing more than the naked economic domination that allows Alberich to enslave and ruthlessly exploit the toiling proletariat of his Nibelung brethren. And by the way, there can be little doubt that Wagner thought of the myth of the Ring des Nibelungen as capturing the essential features of contemporary world. An entry in his wife's Cosima's diary, dated May 25, 1877, quotes the composer's impressions after a visit to London's Docklands, in other words, to the very heart of modernity and capitalism. Quote, Wagner says, "This is Alberich's dream come true. Nibelheim, world dominion, activity, work, everywhere the oppressive feeling of steam and fog," unquote. And of course, you remember that steam is a very important element in Wagner's staging techniques. He has installed a locomotive under the stage of his Bayreuth theater in order to produce adequate amounts of steam. This was an important symbol in his work. This part of Wagner's Allegory captured well the essential tension within the public realm in European and North American societies of mid-19th century, and it has lost little of its diagnostic force even for the liberal democracies of our own day. Power exercised on the basis of traditional legal and constitutional arrangements can be experienced by the members of the society as legitimate, even if these arrangements are seen as highly imperfect and unjust. Such power is political, subject to at least a certain degree of public scrutiny and control, and hence it can be exercised openly. Power exercised by a plutocrat simply because he has at his disposal vastly larger sums of money than his fellows will necessarily lack legitimacy in the eyes of the society's members. The more so, the more recent and vast the fortune in question. Such power is economic rather than political, subject to no public scrutiny and control, and hence has to be exercised surreptitiously, remain hidden. The aristocracies that, in spite of all the revolutions, had continued to dominate much of European politics until at least the First World War, have long since disappeared, but the potential of privately owned money to influence, undermine, and corrupt the publicly debated and arrived at political decisions remains as alive today as it was around 1850. It is one of the central unresolved issues destabilizing our public world. Indeed, this inescapable instability of liberal democracy might be seen as the tension between its democratic and its liberal components, between the public good and private selfishness. The debate on the respective claims of democratic politics and liberal markets between those who, from Rousseau through Marx and beyond, fear the power of privately owned capital to undermine and corrupt the public good, and those who, from Adam Smith on, fear that the public suppression of private self-interest would stifle the main engine of economic growth and hence both enslave and impoverish all, has now been raging for the last 2.5 centuries and is unlikely to abate anytime soon, since we shall continue to have to balance the need to protect the wealth-producing innovation that goes with free markets and the need to defend the public good-producing democratic politics from contamination by private money. The struggle between Wotan and Alberich goes on. In this conflict, Wagner thinks, this conflict requires resolution, or better yet, a revolutionary sweeping aside. For radicals like Wagner, and it is immaterial whether they are of the left or of the right, this very instability is intolerable. They dream of replacing it with a world from which all conflicts will have been rooted out. The centrists, by contrast, and again it is immaterial whether they are of the liberal or conservative bent, dread all utopian visions of a perfectly harmonious world and celebrate the institutions of modernity for their ability to tolerate and temporarily resolve conflicts and thus keep our world permanently open-ended and unfinished. Let's return, though, to Wagner's Allegory. What preceded this old and current regime was the natural world that predated history and its struggles for power. The prelapsarian, eternal world of the earth goddess Erda, whose three daughters, the Norns, spin the threads of destiny to which even the gods are subject, and of river Rhine and his three daughters, guardians of the natural resources, such as gold, the exploitation of which is the basis of Alberich's claim to power. The regime change involves wiping the slate of nature clean of all history and culture, burning down the gods' luxury residence of Valhalla, returning the ring fashioned from the stolen Rheingold to its rightful owners, and beginning from the beginning. In the beginning, then, there was a timeless natural order. Culture and history began when this order was disturbed. And it was disturbed twice, first by Wotan and then by Alberich. Long before Alberich robbed the Rhine of its gold in order to forge of it his ring, Wotan, bored by his youthful pursuit of love and turning his attention to politics, broke off a branch of the sacred world ash tree in order to make of it the shaft of his spear on which the contracts and laws of his regime were to be recorded. This act has had devastating long-term effects on the natural world. Over many years, the world ash gradually died, and the spring of natural wisdom it shaded dried out. Wotan's political order is no less a problem in search of a solution than Alberich's economic order. Both need to be replaced if the original ecological harmony is ever to be restored. If anything, the original sin is Wotan's, his act of violence being the earlier of the two. But it is Alberich's transgression and fall that receives most of our attention, since it is dramatized on stage in the very first scene of the cycle. About Wotan's transgression we learn much later and only second hand. Alberich too gives up on love in order to gain power. The prerequisite for the forging of the wealth and power-giving ring is the renunciation of love. Indeed, Wagner is right to see the link between the renunciation of love and the ability to amass money as essential. It is not simply the matter of delayed gratification, the need to postpone expenditure on pleasure in order to be able to accumulate. It is rather that the expenditure on pleasure is completely out of place here. The fact we can assign a monetary price to anything does not mean that we should. Not everything we value should have a price. There are goods that get corrupted once we assign a price to them. Love is the supreme example of such a good, because it belongs to its essence that it be freely given and received, not traded. Thus, in the essentially Rousseauist vision that Wagner shared with virtually all of his young Hegelian generation, begins the history of the world, with the fall from the original, unchanging, and harmonious unity with nature into man's alienation from and suppression of his natural instincts and drives, so that he may concentrate on the world's changing accumulation of wealth and power. Scene 1 sets the stage of everything that will follow, and proximately for the main story of Das Rheingold, this is the ring's initial introductory evening, the story of how the luxurious abode of the gods, the Valhalla, was paid for with Nibelung's ring. The history initiating Alberich's fall is the price of civilization. Wagner does not want us to miss this crucially important connection between the ring and the castle. If we miss it, we shall never understand why the damage Alberich wrought cannot be repaired by simply returning the golden ring to its rightful owners, the Rhine and his daughters, why it requires also that the Valhalla be burned down. And this is the question that any interpretation of the ring must answer. The institutions of the luxurious civilization that the fall made possible must be destroyed if a different and better, disalienated world is to emerge. If the ring is to provide a vision of final redemption, the logic of the narrative suggests an ending in which both Alberich and Wotan will be replaced by something better, something that will restore the natural order and leave it undisturbed in the future. Wotan has sinned against nature no less than Alberich, and hence the twilight of the gods is not only inevitable, it is also justified and desirable. Now, if the world of Das Rheingold seems hopelessly entangled, devoid of any viable perspectives, it is because it is not complete. It is a world without humans. The next two evenings of the Ring are designed to introduce the two humans whose role it will be to open a different, more hopeful future. The story of Die Walküre, this is the second installment of the cycle, is basically the story of how Brünnhilde got transformed from a callous teenage divinity into a compassionate and grown-up human being, and thus got ready to play her world historical role. And the story of Siegfried, this is the third evening of the Ring, is the story of how its protagonist got transformed from an unruly teenager into a hero, and thus ready to play his world historical role. Their role will be precisely to replace the old regime with a new one. This something better with which the unsatisfactory Ancien Regime should be replaced is the world of free, fearless, and loving humans, Siegfried and Brünnhilde, humans liberated from the burdens of history and its accumulating obligations, and from the lust to dominate others, and guided instead by mutual love. Love is their answer, because love is something that can neither be bought and thus come under the sway of Alberich, nor legislated and thus come under the rule of Wotan without being corrupted out of existence, while it can give content to freedom. Together, they look forward to the world of the future, the world of the free, fearless, loving human beings who no longer seek Wotan's or Alberich's tutelage. To be sure, in the final evening of the cycle, Götterdämmerung, they do perish, and to this extent the Ring is a tragedy, but they also manage to return the Ring and burn down the castle, leaving the surviving humanity the examples of their fearless love, and to this extent the Ring is an optimistic utopia. The tragedy, in fact, is built into the essential fabric of Siegfried's character, and implicitly shows just how utopian the whole project of replacing the existing world with something better really is. In a diary entry of March 12, 1872, Cosima Wagner noted these words of her husband, quote, "Siegfried lives entirely in the present. He is the hero, the finest gift of the will," unquote. But living in the present means forgetting the past. And forgetting the past is indeed what Siegfried's character is all about. He has come to make the earth free of past commitments, to destroy the traditionally legally binding contracts guarded by Wotan's spear. His very first step into the real human world shows just how impossibly utopian that calling is. No sooner does he descend Brünnhilde's rock and arrives in the actual world of the human, all too human Nibelungs, he is ensnared by Alberich's son and tool, Hagen, to forget Brünnhilde and marry a Nibelung princess, Gudrune. In other words, no sooner is one commitment forgotten, another replaces it, because making contracts is what humans do, is essential if a human community is to achieve any stability and relative permanence. In fact, the roots of the self-contradictory nature of Siegfried's character go even deeper. Once you give up on all gods and all transcendence, and this is the Siegfried project, you necessarily give up on all permanence too and embrace change in a radical fashion. This is because only a transcendent order can give a permanent sense to the transient here and now. But Siegfried, like Kierkegaard's Don Giovanni, turns his back on all that transcends the present moment, all stable meaning, and hence, even without the potion Hagen prepares for him, he is bound to forget the past. Nothing that happens to him can be linked with or rooted in the past. The overman of the future, if he ever abandons the present, it is only to rush headlong into the future, into new adventures. What the ring shows are the consequences of this kind of existence when it comes into contact with the humanity as we know it. Indirectly, it also suggests the rather chilling possibility that if the new world with which our heroes would want to replace the old order is ever to be successful, not only the gods, but also the humanity as we know it would need to be replaced. Tragedy and utopia belong together. Siegfried dies groping toward a metaphysical vision of love that transcends life as lived here and now. This vision is his legacy. And it is Brünnhilde's legacy too, her final monologues, and similarly to his, with a vision of a love union that transcends the limiting conditions of earthly existence. In the end, they are one, and they both end up in the same place, with a vision of transcendent love, which is what ultimately they have to offer as a replacement for the this-worldly values of Alberich and Wotan. Now, dazed by the apocalyptic conflagration that ends the ring, some listeners and viewers, maybe you, might leave the theater under the impression that what you have just witnessed was a staged ending of the world. This would be a mistake. What you have witnessed is not the end of the world. Much of the world, nature, humans, remains intact. Only the end of Alberich's stand-in Hagen, of Wotan with his gods, and of the heroic couple that brought about the downfall of the old order. The world has not been annihilated, but only burned and washed clean of the old regime, so that the new order might replace it. In short, we have witnessed an apocalyptic revolution, but not the apocalypse itself. And the orchestral peroration that ends the work serves to express the authorial admiration for the heroic role model couple of the humanity of the future. It only seems that with the destruction of the ring and the Valhalla atoning for the original rape of nature, we are back where we started. Actually, we are not. The sufferings of the Welsungs, of Siegfried and Brünnhilde, the whole slaughterhouse of history, were not in vain. Humanity's restored unity with healed nature is something else than the original innocence. The trials and errors of history have been the laboratory that has produced useful lessons for the post-revolutionary future. But what actually are these lessons, and how useful are they? In February 1848, that is shortly before Wagner conceived a plan for his Siegfried drama, it was originally to be called The Death of Siegfried, Siegfried's Tod, as a new wave of revolutions that were to sweep much of continental Europe, Wagner's Dresden included, broke out in Paris. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published in London a short tract entitled Manifesto of the Communist Party. The political, economic, social condition of the age in the advanced countries of Europe and North America, as diagnosed by the authors of this catechism, is characterized by the already largely victorious, though perhaps still to be completed, struggle of the modern bourgeoisie against the pre-modern feudal aristocracies. The pre-modern feudal society was fairly static, or at any rate changing at a very slow rate and gradually, and it was held together by countless bonds of traditional allegiances, rights, and duties, the mutual allegiances of parents and children, guildmasters and apprentices, vassals and lords, some codified in positive law, some merely rooted in custom, all accompanied by deeply felt and unquestioned sentiments. The victorious advance of the bourgeoisie during and since the French Revolution has been destroying these traditional bonds and disenchanting the world, creating a dynamic, perpetually changing society. You remember the famous words, constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all the earliest ones. The diagnosis is undoubtedly compelling to this extent. I continue the quotation, all fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind, unquote. The solvent by means the bourgeoisie has been destroying all traditional bonds and emotional attachments and replacing them with the cold, naked self-interest alone is private property in its most abstract monetary form, the capital. Quote, the essential conditions for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of the capital, unquote. The capital is at once the means, the weapon that gives the bourgeoisie their victories, and the aim, since the bourgeois wants nothing but to form and augment his capital. As a result, as it progresses, the bourgeoisie transmutes everything into capital. In short, the bourgeoisie has replaced all that has been traditionally valued and loved by one thing only, the monetary exchange value. This goes even for the most hallowed and natural of all human bonds, that linking family members. The modern order represents an advance over the pre-modern one, as it has unleashed humanity's productive potential and created a more dynamic society. But nevertheless, it is intolerable, since it creates social conditions in which a small minority, the bourgeoisie, ruthlessly exploits the vast majority, proletariat, and in which all bonds of human solidarity are destroyed and replaced by pitiless competition for money among thus isolated individuals. Hence, it needs to be destroyed and replaced by something better. To be sure, the authors are rather vague as to what this something better might actually be, what will be the specific nature of the bonds and values holding the society of the future together. They know for sure that there will be no exploitation of one class by another, because all classes will disappear, the society will be egalitarian. Beyond that, the best they can come up with is something remarkably vague, a general vision of a universal human brotherhood of free individuals, though, to be sure, neither free nor individuals in the bourgeois sense of these words. Quote, in place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, unquote. But if what needs to be constructed remains murky, what needs to be destroyed, and by what means, is perfectly clear. The desired change requires yet another violent revolution, this time a proletarian rather than a bourgeois one, that will abolish private property. This entails also the abolition of trade, of buying and selling, including the buying and selling of labor. If the author's proposals to put all capital at the disposal of the state and to mobilize compulsory labor armies, in other words, though not the words the authors would have chosen, to replace wage labor with slave labor. If these proposals entail violence, coercion, and despotism, this does not trouble our authors, since the goods and values to be abolished have all the bourgeois character. Eventually, they promise, the state will disappear, since the state is nothing but a tool of class exploitation.
And the law, sorry.
Yes, exactly. No less than Wagner, in the years when he worked on the Ring poem, his younger contemporary Marx, the main theoretical brain behind the Communist Manifesto, inherited and developed further the philosophical dream formulated a century earlier by Rousseau and transmitted with additional refinements by his German successors, particularly by the thinker who most powerfully formed the generation that came of age between 1830 and 1848, Hegel. The dream bequeathed by Rousseau involved the abolition of the hostile and painful separation between humans and their world, that is, also between man and his fellows, a return on a higher level, that is, under the conditions of a fully developed civilization, to the primeval harmony between man and between humans and nature. To realize this dream, one needed first to locate the causes of man's alienation from his world. Unlike Hegel, who identified these causes in the self-developmental activity of the supra-individual social cultural Geist, that is the internal developmental dynamic of culture, Marx agreed with the leaders of the Hegelian left, such as Feuerbach, that the causes of alienation lie in the empirical, this worldly situation of man, though he rejected Feuerbach's specific claim that the alienation was the result of our mythologizing displacement of our own values onto the other divine world. Instead, he proposed to seek the external material causes of alienation, to see it as the inevitable result of technological progress that lead to the division of labor and the resultant alienation of labor, the situation in which, instead of recognizing ourselves in our own products, when using them, we are enslaved by them because we treat them as tradable commodities whose value lies not in the use we make of them, but in the possibility of exchange by means of the abstract medium of money. The social process of exchange, functioning without any human control, as if it were an impersonal law of nature, inevitably leads to the accumulation of the capital in the hands of the few and the enslavement of the dispossessed many. In this way, the alienation of labor results in the institution of private property and the political and legal arrangements that defend it. Once one has identified the causes of alienation, one can work toward its elimination by removing its causes, and hence the political program of the Communist Manifesto. The abolition of private property, presumably also of its source in the division of labor. But since the owners of the capital are unlikely to give it up of their own free will, a violent revolution is the only way in which this program might be realized. Now, I should stress, Wagner was not a Marxist, and it even remains uncertain if he ever read the Manifesto or anything else by Marx. The source of Wagner's glorification of human love is Feuerbach, his left Hegelian, young Hegelian of choice, and the author we know he did read, while his hatred of the capital and generalized anarchism owed a lot to the ideas of Proudhon, about whom he learned from his friend and fellow revolutionary August Röckel, and whom he also read, and of course Mikhail Bakunin, with whom he was in direct contact at the time immediately preceding and during the Dresden Rebellion. But for all the undeniable differences between their positions, and I'm going to stress these differences in a moment, the similarities between Wagner and Marx are even more striking and unsurprising given their common young Hegelian and ultimately Rousseauist heritage. No less than Marx in the Manifesto, also Wagner in The Ring was driven by the contrast between what is and what should be, between the actual present condition of humanity, a condition characterized by man's alienation from his fellows and from nature, and the desired future condition in which the alienation would disappear, leaving men and women to relate to one another like siblings or lovers, or both, not like the deadly competitors for economic advantage and political power. No less than Marx, also Wagner reckoned that to reach this goal, one would first have to identify and then destroy the root causes of alienation. Where Feuerbach located these causes in human propensity to worship gods, and where Marx thought that he found the causes of alienation in the institutions of market economy, Wagner's Ring represents something of a synthesis between these two views, with both Wotan's gods and Alberich's capital standing in the way of the disalienating humanity of the future. By the way, Wagner's anti-capitalist beliefs at the time of Ring's conception are very well documented. There is, for example, an interesting entry, December 2, 1848, in the diary of a fellow artist in Dresden, Edward de Vriend. After a reading of the Siegfried Tod poem, the conversation took a political turn, quote, at which point he, Wagner, again mounted his hobby horse, the annihilation of the capital, unquote. Finally, no less than Marx, also Wagner thought that the only way to achieve the desired goal was a violent revolution that would push Wotan aside, shattering his spear and burning the Valhalla, and equally would permanently deprive Alberich of the Ring. Again, my claim is not that the Ring put the Communist Manifesto on stage. Bakunin was surely a much more immediate influence on the composer than Marx, and it was with Bakunin that Wagner shared the gospel of the necessary revolutionary destruction. My claim, rather, is one of close family resemblance. Both the Ring and the Manifesto are characteristic and arguably the most prominent and influential documents of the state of mind widely shared by radical intellectuals at mid-19th century, expressing there to a large extent converging diagnoses and hopes at the time of what Louis Namier so memorably dubbed the revolution of the intellectuals, the century's high watermark of revolutionary fever. To see both the similarities and the differences still more clearly, one needs to consider three aspects of the positions elaborated in the Manifesto and the Ring. What the author's claim needs to be destroyed, by what means, and what should be put in its place. The diagnosis of the modern condition of the developed world, the world that needs to be destroyed, offered in the Ring, is remarkably close to that of the Manifesto. Both Wagner and Marx see their world as defined by the struggle for dominance between the older and declining feudal aristocracy, the defenders of slowly accumulating rights and obligations, some customary, some legally codified, and the newer and ascending bourgeoisie intent on replacing all custom and law by the naked power of privately owned capital. To be sure, their diagnoses are not identical. For Marx, the bourgeoisie has already been largely victorious. I think Wagner was more realistic. He saw the struggle between Wotan and Alberich as still going on and unresolved. More realistic, since in most of Europe aristocracies retained significant power and influence through the First World War. Marx had a tendency to underestimate the importance of the political. Wagner's picture is of this painfully uncomfortable intertwining of politics and money. Seems richer, more realistic, more illuminating of the world of his and of our own time. Moreover, the fundamental motivation behind the respective diagnosis of modernity differs in at least one important respect. Marx wants to emancipate the downtrodden and exploited majority, the proletariat. Wagner, an artist to the core of his being, is interested mostly in the fate of art, and most especially his own art, the art of opera, under the modern conditions. In the earliest and today perhaps least read of his Zurich reform essays that accompanied the gestation of the Ring, but one that allows us best insight into his overall political cultural outlook at the time, Art and Revolution. This was written in 1849 and published in 1850. Wagner made clear that these modern conditions, involving as they did the rule of commerce, were even more inimical to art than the far from perfect pre-modern forms of church and aristocratic patronage. Wagner's anti-capitalism is driven not so much by the desire to liberate the Nibelungs as by the wish to emancipate opera from Alberich's profits motive, since it debases serious ethically demanding art into low entertainment. Similarly, both Wagner and Marx see the present world not as crying for reform and improvement, but as requiring wholesale destruction, a violent revolution. Siegfried's sword, the flooding waters of the Rhine, and above all the cleansing final conflagration, all are needed to destroy both the declining rule of custom and law and the ascending rule of the capital. Indeed, the extent to which Wagner's imagination was fired by the spectacle of a cleansing conflagration in the years in which he was working on the Ring is really striking. Each evening of the cycle takes a fiery ending, with Brünnhilde being enclosed in a ring of flames at the end of Die Walküre, her heroic lover penetrating this ring at the end of Siegfried, and both, as well as the gods, going up in flames at the end of Götterdämmerung. During the Dresden Rebellion, on hearing that the opera house burned down, May 6, 1849, the composer jotted down this note in his annals, quote, "Opera house now burned down, strangely contented." Unquote. Wagner's letters of the period, too, overflow with pyromania. In a letter to Theodor Ulich, September 20, 1850, he envisages 3 performances of Siegfried's Tod within 1 week to be given in a purpose-built theater in Zurich, after which the theater would be torn down and the score burned. Similarly, in a letter to Clara Brockhaus, March 12, 1854, we read, quote, "After the performance of the Ring, I shall throw myself with the score on Brünnhilde's funeral pyre so that everything burns down," unquote. Perhaps the most telling example is found in the letter to Ulich again, October 22, 1850. Quote, "I no longer believe in any other revolution save that which begins with the burning down of Paris," Wagner writes. And then he continues, "Look, just as we need a water cure to heal our bodies, so we need a fire cure in order to remedy, that is, to destroy the cause of our illness, a cause that is all around us," unquote. In this, his most radical period, the composer, who by the way was a firm believer in spas and water cures, burns with the desire for a fire cure, a cleansing conflagration that would engulf and consume the utterly unredeemable existing order. And still long after the subsiding of this revolutionary fever during the Franco-Prussian War, Wagner's hope that Paris, at least, might be burned down lives on. on August 18, 1870, his wife notes, quote, "Richard says he hopes Paris, this kept woman of the world, will be burned down. The burning of Paris would be a symbol of the world's liberation at last from the pressure of all that is bad," unquote. Moreover, in Wagner's mind, the political and the artistic revolution embodied in the Ring blend into one. His self-characterization in A Communication to My Friend, a text he wrote in 1851, is unambiguous and emphatic. Quote, "I am neither a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor a socialist, nor a communist, but an artistic person, and as such, everywhere where my sight, my wish, and my will reaches, a revolutionary through and through, a destroyer of the old in the creation of the new," unquote. And there are similar sentiments in many other places. I would just like to read you one more letter, this again to Theodor Ulik, November 12, 1851. He says the following thing, "I can no longer suffer the torments of half measures. With this new conception of mine," he means the Ring, "I am moving completely out of touch with the present-day theater and its audiences. I am breaking decisively and forever with the present. A performance of the planned cycle is something I can conceive only after the revolution. Only the revolution can offer me the artists and listeners I need. The coming revolution must necessarily put an end to this whole theatrical business of ours. Out of the ruins, I shall then summon what I need. I shall run up a theater on the Rhine and send out invitations to a great dramatic festival. After a year's preparation, I shall perform my entire work within the space of 4 days. With it, I shall then make clear to the men of the revolution the meaning of that revolution in its noblest sense," unquote. Where Wagner and Marx differ is in their identification of the potential revolutionaries. Wagner's revolutionaries are not Marxist proletarians. The composer does not envisage an active world historical role for the Nibelungs enslaved by Alberich. Instead, his revolutionaries, Siegfried and Brünnhilde, are naturally free individuals of no particular class, in fact, of socially uncertain origin and status, unanchored individuals driven by passion and instinct and not by the values of an inherited or assumed social position. In short, modern artist types, unfettered by any social role, without a church or court salaried employment, like so many Wagnerian heroes. Think Tannhäuser, think Lohengrin, Walter, or Parsifal, of course, in addition to Siegfried. Or like Wagner himself, coming out of nowhere and bringing good tidings. Part artists, part Rousseau's men of nature, part Nietzsche's overmen, but wholly men of the future. Even so, the vision of the future offered by Wagner is not entirely unrelated to that offered by Marx, and it is remarkably similar in its vagueness. What is clear is that for both it would be a future without Alberich or Wotan, without privately owned capital, without legally enforceable rights and obligations. In other words, without market-regulated economy and law-regulated politics, with their inherent exploitation and competition. Now, Marx proposed to put all capital and labor in the hands of the state, vaguely promising that eventually the state will wither. Wagner, not obliged to write a party program, did not even bother to indicate the intermediary stage between the dismal present and the radiant future. Both hoped that eventually, instead of competing for economic advantage and political power, humans would relate to one another through spontaneously arising bonds of sympathy. The vision of the future presented in the manifesto I have already quoted to you, the vision of the future presented in The Ring, is intimated in Siegfried's and Brünnhilde's perorations and paeans to love. Where Marx dreams of a brotherhood of the free, Wagner follows Feuerbach and dreams of a sexual union of the free. Common to both is a characteristic romantic Prometheism or Faustianism. Neither Marx nor Wagner wants to restore or preserve the traditional values and allegiances of the pre-modern past with its unjust hierarchies, inequalities, privileges. Both believe that traditional injustices can and need to be swept aside, that mankind's ability to remake itself according to its own, or rather their own, design is unlimited. And neither is deterred by the thought of the violence needed to realize their Faustian projects. Along with other radicals of 1848, both have thoroughly forgotten or ignored the prophetic diagnosis and warnings issued by Edmund Burke in 1790. Common to both, too, is the romantic revulsion against the recently emerged industrial society, seen as dissolving all traditional values and allegiances and replacing them with naked, ruthless competition for money and power among isolated individuals, as well as the revulsion against the theoretical underpinning of this society in the philosophy of liberalism that assumed the natural egoism of individuals, requiring a theory of social contract that would harmonize conflicting interests through legal mechanisms that safeguard collective and individual security by putting limits on individual freedom. The thought stemming from Bernard Mandeville and Adam Smith that competing individual egoisms can actually produce socially beneficial outcomes does not persuade them. The romantics, such as Wagner and Marx, do not see the society as necessarily consisting of naturally isolated and egoistic individuals. Such a society for them is a contingent product of recent historical development. Instead, they assume the primacy and desirability of a community held together by bonds of naturally arising sympathy and solidarity among its equal members, bonds that spontaneously cause each individual to identify with the community as a whole. Unlike the society of the present, the community of the future will not need the mediation of a social contract or law to maintain its unifying bonds. It will be held together by sympathy without any mediation. For all their differences, both Wagner and Marx postulate for us some sort of vaguely imagined post-political and post-legal future, and neither is deterred by the thought of the despotism such a future entails. To Wagner, in his most radical anarchist period, the thought of despotism does not seem even to have occurred. It did occur to Marx, but he was not really bothered by it much. Now, I have suggested that the similarities between Wagner and Marx's position can be explained by their common heritage in the strain of modern thinking initiated by Rousseau. But I believe their common roots go even deeper, all the way back to the teachings of Jesus. Wagner's Ring in particular, with its picture of the essential historical progress consisting in the replacement of Wotan's rule of law by Siegfried's and Brünnhilde's rule of love, resonates with Jesus's and of course Paul's, Augustine's, Luther's doctrine that the spontaneous solidarity among humans and between man and God, solidarity rooted in love, renders the prescriptions of the law superfluous, that the bonds of love should replace the bonds of contracts. This fundamental intuition is also the deepest root of all the utopias of universal human brotherhood, the Marxist one included. Needless to say, neither Marx nor Wagner can be considered Christians. In particular, the love Wagner preaches in The Ring is the erotic love of Feuerbach, not the love of one's neighbor that Jesus proclaimed. For the composer's conversion from eros to agape, you need to wait until Parsifal. his last work. More importantly, the Promethean belief common to the mid-19th century radicals that the kingdom of universal brotherhood can be fully realized on earth is profoundly at odds with the wiser and safer Christian understanding that the earthly city, driven by envy and competition for earthly goods, is unlikely ever to be fully replaced here on earth by the city of God, animated by charity, no matter how hard we try. In other words, it would be a mistake to consider the ring simply as an attempt to dress Christianity in a Germanic garb. But equally, it would be a mistake not to notice its Christian roots, a mistake that would render Wagner's evolution from the ring to Parsifal puzzling and incomprehensible. Now, the problem with this way of thinking, indeed the central problem with the worldview promoted in Wagner's Ring, is that the rule of law means justice, and justice is no less a virtue than love. We need both, and in this world, at any rate, one cannot replace the other. This is because their spheres of validity do not completely coincide. Justice is the virtue we need primarily in the public sphere, love in the private sphere. Wagner's dream of replacing justice with love goes hand in hand with his dream of a post-political future, a dream prophetic of the utopian political experiments of the early 20th century. Now, the Ring des Nibelungen may have been conceived and received as an answer to the call for a German national opera. The mythic material of the Nibelungen Lied having been widely taken in the 19th century Germany as the national epic, a Germanic equivalent of the Homeric poems. It is for this reason, probably, and surely also because of his rapidly growing prestige as the nation's preeminent artist, that Wagner managed the seemingly impossible feat of assembling for its premiere at Bayreuth in the summer of 1876 the political, economic, and social elites of the newly minted German Reich, the Kaiser himself included. It has to be seen as an act of unprecedented impudence and audacity, however, that what the composer offered these elites for their contemplation was not, in fact, the expected national epic, but the spectacle of their own impending demise. What Wagner made of his mythic material is not a national opera. This he offered elsewhere in the Meistersinger. Not the foundational story of the emerging unified Germany, but something much more universal, a foundational story of the as yet to be created new post-revolutionary world. Indeed, instead of a national myth, the composer has fashioned in the Ring what must be considered the artistically most significant embodiment of this most pernicious ideological legacy of the 19th century, the myth of the revolution, of the necessary and violent destruction of the old world, of economic markets and political legalities to make room for something unprecedented, new, and immeasurably better, a perfectly unified society free of exploitation and competition. As the revolutions of 1848-49 failed, the attractiveness of this myth seemed gradually to have faded too. By 1876, the political and economic potentates of Germany could contemplate it without terror, perhaps even without much comprehension. The catastrophes of the 20th century, however, have shown that this fading has been only temporary, that in the conditions of acute crisis created by the First World War, the promises of the myth of the revolution, whether in its red or brown version, may regain their attractiveness. Even today, with the period that ended in 1989 long behind us, it is far from certain that the myth has lost all of its allure, that the virus is dead rather than dormant. After all, we are as troubled now as Wagner's contemporaries were then by money's uncanny power to corrupt all the values that we hold dear, and as unsure that we know how to hold this power in check, more troubled than they were by our continuing the spoilment endowment of nature, and as ready to think that the solidarity among equals might be preferable to competitive struggle and exploitation. The only hope is that we have become more skeptical than they had been about the prospects of our ever mastering the technique of producing perfect social cohesion without resorting to despotism. Thank you.